Welcome flight simmers. In this video, I will demonstrate the use of the SimTrim software, what it does, what it's for, and how to use it. You may be wondering why SimTrim is needed at all. After all, I am happy with my trim wheel. It works fine, doesn't it? An analog trim wheel is far more accurate and precise than a digital one, which uses a series of button pulses to achieve elevator trim movement. Although an analog wheel is superior in many ways to a digital one, it suffers from one major drawback. An analog wheel is not synchronized with the SimTrim wheel. This can cause a big jolt when transitioning from autopilot, for example, back to physically trimming. This is not a problem for a digital wheel, as it just sends button pulses to the sim, and then the sim just adds up or down motion to the current elevated trim state, depending on which button it receives. Many people opt for a digital trim wheel because of this jolt problem. But then they are losing the benefits of analog. SimTrim is designed to eliminate this jolt issue, while still retaining all the benefits of analog. Let's demonstrate this more clearly by showing what happens without SimTrim before showing the use with SimTrim. First, I will just check that my trim wheel is assigned in Microsoft Flight Simulator. It's clearly assigned to elevator trim axis in the control options. Back to the cockpit. I have changed the instrument view so we can see the trim wheel more clearly. If I turn the physical trim wheel, we can see the in-sim wheel turning simultaneously, and it's working as expected. This shows that the sim can see and receive input from a physical device. No problem. Now, watch what happens when I use the mouse cursor to move the wheel. Observe the indicator needle as I do this. It has moved way off center. This is an exaggeration for demonstration purposes, but imagine you were trying to reach a certain altitude with autopilot. The autopilot would be adjusting your trim to reach that altitude. In that scenario, the virtual wheel and trim indicator would also be moved by the sim and not by your device. Keeping an eye on the indicator still, watch what happens when I rotate my trim device. The indicator has jumped sharply back to roughly the center again. Let's show that again. The issue here is that the sim and the physical wheel are not synchronized, and your physical wheel only reports its current state to the sim. It cannot receive anything from the sim, not by default anyway. We are on the ground currently, but imagine if this happened mid-flight. The plane would suddenly climb or nosedive. This situation happens after turning off autopilot and switching back to manual trimming, which is a big problem, to put it mildly. Now, try using the SimTrim software to help with this problem. First, we need to clear our elevator trim wheel assignment in the simulator. This is because we want SimTrim to control the inputs from our trim wheel and not Flight Simulator. Go to Control Options, select the device if not already selected, click on the drop-downs until elevator trim axis is shown, and click in the box that displays which axis is assigned to it, joystick R axis X in this case. Clear current input and validate. Apply and save and go back to the sim. Next, load SimTrim and select the desired joystick type device from the tabs at the top. Select Elevator Trim from the drop-down menu of the axis you want to use. In my case, I select my Trim Wheel Pro and assign the elevator trim to the RX axis, as that is the only axis on this device. Leave SimTrim running in the background and switch back to Flight Simulator. You can also set up SimTrim before Flight Simulator starts, and it will work just fine that way too. Here, I am just physically moving my trim wheel to confirm SimTrim is working as expected. Again, keep an eye on the indicator as I move the trim wheel with the mouse cursor. Again, the indicator has moved from its initial position. Now watch the needle as I move my trim wheel. The needle stays roughly in the same position this time. So, SimTrim has done its job, and there is no big jolt back to the center as before. I think you can imagine how life-saving this is. Transitioning from autopilot, for example, is not a problem anymore. Now mid-flight, and still using SimTrim. Rotating the wheel is no longer causing big initial jolts, as it did before. A little too sensitive perhaps, but the sensitivity can be adjusted in SimTrim too, so you can fine-tune it exactly the way you want. By the way, you can make sensitivity adjustments on the go, so there is no need to keep opening and closing the control options. Now I want to demonstrate that SimTrim can be used with any axis on any device. It does not have to be a dedicated trim wheel. I will use my Gladiator NXT joystick for this. I bring SimTrim up once more, select the Z-axis and sync this with elevator trim. The Z-axis is a small throttle lever on the base of the Gladiator, by the way. Because the lever has a very limited range of motion, any small adjustment will result in a very large elevator trim change. Nevertheless, I will now make a very small adjustment to this lever. As you can see, this is way too sensitive. We can change the sensitivity mid-flight through SimTrim. Let's reduce the sensitivity for the Gladiator by moving the slider. Higher values here reduce the sensitivity. We can see the trim is much less sensitive now, whilst remaining quite effective still. The downside of using a lever as your elevator trim device is that you will suffer with a reduced range of motion. Adjusting the sensitivity reduces the range even further, which may or may not be a problem for you. SimTrim's aim was to eliminate the jolt problem, and as a result, make an analog trim wheel a viable alternative to a digital one. I think SimTrim met that goal. I hope you agree and find SimTrim as useful as I have. Happy flying!